For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our patrons on Patreon. Thank you. If you feel inspired by this podcast, please subscribe, share it on social media, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. For episode 25, I wanted to go a little deeper into just what rewilding means. It's always a challenge exploring a word and seeing it pop up all over the place over the years. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of jump back and re-examine the word, which is something that I like to do from time to time, or a lot of the time. And especially because today, every day I see new versions of the word popping up or new ways that it's being used. And yesterday somebody sent me a link and told me that there's a video game coming out now called Rewilding. And it claims to be along the lines of Final Fantasy VII, which of course was one of my favorite video games of all time as a child and growing up with sort of that eco-consciousness. And I'm hoping that that's true. At the same time, it's like, oh great, here's the word rewilding being used in another bizarre context. And is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do they mean when they say rewilding? This is kind of what I want to explore a little bit in this episode. And so one of the best places to start is, of course, the origin of the word itself. And I know I covered some of this before in other podcasts, but I don't think I've distilled it specifically. I don't think I've done a podcast just on what rewilding means. In my introductory podcast, I talked a little bit about myself, how I came across the word, probably some brief history of it. And in my Rewild or Die chapter, I talked a little bit about it as well. But I thought today might be a good opportunity to sort of jump into an abridged version of my first class in my Rewilding 101 online program that I teach, and to just kind of set the stage as we explore this word together here for how I use it in the podcast. Rewilding as a term, from my understanding, arose from the Earth First milieu of Eugene, Oregon in the United States in the 1980s. There's a man by the name Jesse Wolf Hardin who wrote an essay in 1985 called The Rewilding, which was published in a couple of different publications over the span of the 1980s, 90s, and even the early aughts, I believe. And then, of course, you had Dave Foreman, not George Foreman. That's a different Foreman. Dave Foreman, who is one of the founders of Earth First, wrote a book called Rewilding the West in the 90s, and that was from the conservation angle. So Jesse Wolf Hardin wrote it using it as a way of humans to reconnect to our own wildness, both individually and culturally. And Dave Foreman used it as just another synonym for essentially a conservation technique where you let wildlands, quote unquote, go wild, or you let lands go wild, and you remove human influence on any landscape whatsoever. And that just harkens back to these false notions of conservation that arose from the early explorers of the United States, who saw wild expanses of lands that were very abundant in wildlife and biodiverse, and they assumed that these were that way because they lacked human presence. But what they had no concept of was that they were actually, in a large part, created in a sort of trophic cascade from prescribed burning done by indigenous people of the Americas or Turtle Island prior to the diseases that swept through and killed so many people. And so there was this false notion by these early settlers that if humans were removed from a landscape, it could return to its natural abundance. And while this is not fully true of the Americas and in these romantic notions of wildness, it is true in a sense that if civilization is removed from a place, if overconsumption of human activity is removed from a place, then obviously there's going to be a regeneration of populations of wildlife. And we've seen this in places like Chernobyl, right, where the nuclear disaster forced the evacuation of people from that landscape. And in response, we've seen wildlife thrive and come back. Many species that were thought extinct in that area, or extirpated rather, have returned and are now thriving in those places. It's not that humans are gone, it's that civilization, it's that this agrarian, overconsumptive society that wants to kill every living thing in the environment and convert it into human food or human resources has left that area. There are plenty of examples of humans living in a relative balance with their ecosystems all around the world without destroying it. So we know that that's not really true. However, this has just been something that has been part of conservation for a really long time. And in a sense, is a reality. If humans are removed completely, we see a rebound in biodiversity. But what we don't acknowledge is that there can be human wildness within those contexts where there is abundance as well. It's not the removal of humans specifically, but the removal of human overconsumptive society, right? But in conservation biology, that's something that is probably just on the forefront of their understanding, in a large part because of the bias against humans that has been part of that for so long, that they think humans innately destroy environments, which is simply not true. So part of my endeavor here with rewilding is to actually unite these two different versions, right, of human rewilding and conservation rewilding. Although conservation rewilding, I think, should just be dismantled and absorbed into the environmental ethic that comes along with the desire to preserve wild spaces. That feeling of wanting to do that and understanding how to encourage biodiversity by minimizing human impacts, I think that could be absorbed into the human rewilding. I don't think that the core elements of the beliefs around conservation can ever be reconciled with wildness, in part because I believe so much of conservation believes inherently that humans are evil. So I think part of that's going to be a dismantling and an absorption into rewilding humans. So that's kind of the two avenues that the word rewilding emerged from in conservation, and basically anarchy is the other element of that, right? So Jesse Wolf Hardin wrote these essays about rewilding as a human practice to reclaim our wildness. And these were absorbed by the anarchists who existed within Earth First in the 80s, and eventually became part of the sort of ethos of what we call anarcho-primitivism, or primal anarchy, a term coined by John Zerzan, which essentially states that, anarchy is, just on its most basic terms, means a stateless society. So, states are a relatively recent invention and have to do with, obviously they're integrated with hierarchy and grains, and you can read all about that in James Scott's book Against the Grain, the earliest, a deep history of the earliest states. And so primal anarchy is considered the environment of evolution, the social environment of evolutionary adaptation. What we evolved in socially for millions of years was stateless societies or anarchy. So primal anarchy is a way of looking at stateless societies that exist today as a form of innate and, wild or natural anarchy. Not that they would ever themselves consider themselves that, because that's a label that we're projecting onto them, right? But they are exemplifying what we think of when we think of anarchy in its most original form, perhaps, as a way of thinking about it. So you had a magazine in the early aughts called Green Anarchy, which was essentially an anarcho-primitivist magazine. And they had an issue dedicated to rewilding. And that's actually where I first came across the word, was through this anarcho-primitivist website. And so for me, it was like finally I have a word to describe what I do. And I created rewild.info, which is now rewild.com. And it was an international forum for people to discuss rewilding humanity, not the conservation side of things, which at that time wasn't really anything other than Dave Foreman's book, Rewilding the West. And for, a decade, we were basically sort of the dominant form of rewilding. At least what you would see of on the internet was mostly rewilding humans, not rewilding landscapes in terms of removing humans. And then George Monbiot's book, or Monbiot, however you say that, Feral, came out. And he's in the UK, and that sort of blew up the term rewilding for conservation. And it hasn't really quieted down since then. I think that was the biggest splash that we've seen for the momentum of the word rewilding to really stick in terms of conservation biology. And of course, it came with all of the same tropes I've already been talking about in terms of conservation, believing that humans are innately evil. I think in a large part that stems from its popularity in Europe, where traditional ecological knowledge has been lost for thousands of years, perhaps, and it's only been challenged by places where there's obvious human inhabiting those spaces where they're not ecologically destroying their ecologies, right? So particularly in the mid-aughts, we have books like Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson and Keeping It Living, edited by Nancy Turner and Doug Doyer, coming out showing these regenerative practices of indigenous people here on the west coast of North America, and that sort of infiltrating into a lot of the conservation ideology around these parts, where we can see that some of these landscapes that we've been doing restoration to, actually, when you restore it to that, but you don't include the human component that was there, they tend to fade away. And that's, again, sort of this keystone species or trophic cascade of disturbance regimes like prescribed burning. So without those practices, those quote-unquote restored landscapes end up just becoming something else again, because they're not having that constant interference or maintenance by the humans that were living there, that in a sense generated those landscapes. And so once we reintroduce that human component, we can actually see how to create those ecologically stable systems. But this is still so far away from conservation biology that I have a hard time imagining how it'll ever actually be integrated, because that belief of humans being innately destructive is so deeply embedded in that culture. And you just, so much so that there are, well, anyway. So that's kind of where, the word is sort of still dwelling today. Is in the mainstream. If you were to Google rewilding, you'd probably come across more of the conservation biology than you would of human rewilding. And then, of course, you had what I call the sort of paleo takeover of rewilding. In the mid 2000 teens, we saw this huge not resurgence, but a huge sort of an explosion of the paleo lifestyle scene kind of trying to claim rewilding as the next deeper part of that movement in and of itself. And so really what then they did was combine paleo lifestyle, which was based off of, the environment of evolutionary adaptation for the human body, and then incorporating like ancestral skills or survival skills as a component of it on top of that. So it was really sort of romanticizing the concept of the sort of false notion of distinct identity of a hunter-gatherer, and projecting the sort of American individualism into the term rewilding and survival skills. So much so that it became another part of the fad of the individual dieting plan. So you have people, quote unquote, rewilding using like meditation. You have them rewilding going on forest bathing. And basically what people started doing was using the word rewilding as a synonym for a collection of other practices that already existed. So forest bathing is not rewilding, but now it's a synonym for it, right? Because you can do forest bathing as part of your rewilding practice. I'm going to get into that a lot more in a little bit. But before we so that's just where I want to land on sort of the history. And that's kind of where we are right now in this moment is you have rewilding as this sort of conservation practice. You have rewilding as this sort of extension, perhaps, of paleo lifestyle. And then you still have the deeper movement of rewilding, that is an anti-civilization, anarchist movement to understand and reclaim wildness while undoing the barriers of domestication. And that's where I want to kind of jump into now, because I think the reason why I have not abandoned the word rewilding is because of the value that the meanings of this word carry, and the value of being able to take this word and use both the negative connotations, the romanticized connotations, and its antithesis, domestication, to really explore what wildness truly means. And, that's where we're going to go. So wildness, in terms of rewilding, we have to look at this word wild. And there's a major problem that arises immediately, and that's people have preconceived notions of the word wild. They think they know what wild means, and most of these preconceived notions, at least in the quote-unquote Western world, are relics of social Darwinism. So we think that wildness means, aggressive, survival of the fittest, meaning aggressive, stronger, more dominating. And we don't take into consideration the variety of strategies that animals implement or plants implement in their own wildness and wild environments. Peter Kropotkin, in his book Mutual Aid, sort of contrasted the competitiveness that people think of when they think of survival of the fittest, and presented the concept that actually in nature, a lot of the strategies that different living organisms use is collaboration and mutualism, or even just commensalism, which is, working side by side, not necessarily benefiting more one than the other, but the lack of competition. That's not to say that competition doesn't exist or isn't a large contributing factor to evolution, but it's not the factor. Wildness is a broad, encompassing thing that covers all of these different types of strategies. And so if we limit ourselves to think that wildness is just competitiveness and domination, and we want to rewild, then we're going to go toward this idea of dominating. And we're going to think that we're moving in a direction of wildness, when really we're pigeonholing what wildness could be. And we're moving in a direction of social Darwinism, where we think that, survival means being aggressive, when it actually could encompass the entire range of strategies. including mutual aid, which we see a lot, perhaps even more than competitiveness during different times. And so that's kind of the starting point, is really looking at wildness and trying to understand what wildness means and all of the different ways that we can interpret that and ways that we can sort of return to that. And for me, the re in rewilding is super important, because what it says is it's not about going back to a certain time or place. It's about going back to the relationship to wildness that we lost when we began relationships of domestication. So it's not, I'm constantly thinking, I should come up with a different word. And I'm sitting there brainstorming, how about enwilding? Because if we're just embracing wildness, if we're trying to bring wildness forth, then enwild, seems like a good strategy for that. But then we lose the whole critique of domestication, of It's acknowledging that we have been separated, and wild doesn't make that acknowledgement. Acknowledges that there has been a separation that needs to be rekindled, reclaimed, restored. And so the is actually very central to understanding the dichotomy between wildness and domestication. In Miles Olson's book, Unlearn Rewild, he writes that the etymology of the word wild comes from willed. I've found this to not be the case in my own research, but it doesn't really matter because the meaning is essentially the same. To be wild is to be willed. To be domesticated is to have your will broken. And we think about, when we talk about breaking a wild horse, what's being broken? What's being broken is the will of the horse so that it will no longer resist captivity. Domestication is about holding living organisms captive for the purpose of human use and consumption. And there's a lot of different ways that domestication works, but the main thing here is to just think about wildness as being willed, and how, in terms of mutualism and mutual aid, when we work together with ecosystems, we're not trying to break the will of those systems. We're working with them. If survival is survival of the fittest, it's not fittest in terms of strength. It's fittest in terms of, can you fit into your environment? Because if you overconsume the things in your environment, you're going to cause the collapse of your environment. And so there has to be an ebb and flow of disturbance and regeneration between any living organism within their ecosystem. And that flow is going to create somewhat of a baseline or a harmony. And when we break the will of others, when we dominate them and overconsume them, then that balance is lost. And we have 10,000 years of that. You have what's called the sixth mass extinction. The majority of living organisms on the planet have been killed for the purpose of human consumption. So domestication has to be examined if we're talking about wildness. And this, to me, is the most important part of the meaning of the word rewilding, and why it frustrates me to see this concept, the word being used for conservation biology or an extension of like paleo, or as a synonym for forest bathing or whatever. I love all of those things. And at the same time, it diminishes the true meaning, which is this critique of domestication. It's a deep understanding of this problem that we've had for a really long time. And so this can go all the way back to, what is domestication? Okay, so domestication is, lots of different dictionary definitions. It's often conflated with being pro-social. So you'll see like articles, the dog domesticated themselves, how humans domesticated each other or themselves. And what they're talking about is pro-socialization. So part of the incorporating of that terminology into domestication, or the concept of it, is because it makes an animal a lot easier to domesticate if they're friendlier towards humans. So the example is like, dogs, right? Like wolves started eating the bones and waste of humans. And the ones that started living off of that more and more became more and more comfortable being around humans. And eventually there was a potential collaboration between wolves and humans, and wolves became dogs. At that point, it's hard to say that, humans were selectively breeding to create the dog. That's not really what happened. Natural selection in mutualism created a pro-social animal. And then once it was pro-social, humans at some point, potentially, in the framework of domestication, began to selectively breed the dog to create a more utilitarian animal for their purpose. And that to me is the dichotomy between wildness, mutualistic relationships, and what I would call domestication, is the sort of controlled breeding, being held in captivity. When the human put a leash on the dog, that's when the dog became domesticated, not when they were co-inhabiting spaces and potentially collaborating and working together for who knows, thousands of years. And the same is true of humans when we see the pro-social behaviors that brought us together as a species, of sharing and these different things. And we see different areas of the brain developing. We see more what's called neoteny, which is like juvenile traits. So one of the things of domestication is that we see juvenile traits being held on to for longer. Now, this is sort of the problem, is because if domestication, from my perspective, is one of, I don't want to say negative, but when I think of domestication, I think of overconsumption. And let me kind of backpedal a little bit. I want to talk about author Daniel Quinn's work. And one of the most important things that he brought to the table, which is what he called the law of limited competition. So the law of limited competition states that any living thing can compete to the best of its abilities, but it cannot seek out and wage war against its competitors or deny them access to resources and food. So an example of this is a bear. A bear and a fox, say they eat similar things, huckleberries or something, right? And a bear doesn't think, if I kill all the foxes, then I'll have all the huckleberries to myself. That's just not a thing that happens cognitively or even behaviorally within these systems. Part of this is about specialization. So each animal or plant fills a niche, a specialized niche. And within that niche, they can only consume what is part of that niche. So they're not they're not generalists. They can't eat all kinds of things. They've evolved to only eat a few specific species of, whether it's plants or animals. An example of this is, the difference between a carnivore and an herbivore, right? They've evolved to eat specific things, whereas an omnivore is much more of a generalist. So like a bear or a human or raccoon, we're more generalist. That doesn't mean that an herbivore doesn't eat animals or that a carnivore doesn't eat plants. It just means that they've adapted more in one direction or the other in the process of natural selection, which led to specialization in those categories. You could think about like the koala bear, which pretty much can only eat eucalyptus leaves. And so they're like almost too specialized in a sense. When something happens to an ecosystem and eucalyptus dies, the koala bear is going to die with it. So they're so intricately linked that their adaptation becomes a challenge to their long-term survival in terms of changing ecosystems. Whereas if something is too adapted, it can eat anything, then their populations can massively grow and destroy an ecosystem. So there's this quote-unquote balance of being not too specialized and not overly generalized so that the consumption is limited. And in part, that limitation is extended into this law of limited competition, which states that nothing will basically overcompete or seek out and destroy its competitors or limit them access to food. Now, if we think about the origins of domesticated animals in particular, and we think about the shepherd, what the shepherd's role was, first you have like reindeer hunters, and reindeer hunters follow the herds of animals, just like wolves follow the herds of animals that they hunt. But at some point there's a conversion that happens, and it's an idea. And that idea is, what if I limited access to this food source from all the other predators, and then we could have it all to ourselves? So the herd of deer, instead of being predated on by multiple species, is now protected, in quotes, and predated on by one species, humans. And that's when you get the shepherd. The role of the shepherd is to, quote unquote, protect the flock. But this separates that herd of animals from the larger ecosystem. It also completely destroys the competitors who had access to that food prior to this, what I would call domesticated mindset, which again, when we start to think of domestication as basically looking at every calorie in the landscape and thinking about how it could be solely for human consumption. And this is, in a sense, being so completely over-adapted or such a generalist that we can eat everything. And, one of the other points that Daniel Quinn brings up often in his work is population. And any species, when it has a surplus of food, will grow to match the surplus. And then there is a reduction when the surplus is reduced. We see this most classically with like snowshoe hare and a lynx in the mountains, where their populations ebb and flow, rise and decline together over time. Well, what happens when a species figures out how to eat everything in their landscape? Then the entire landscape itself becomes a surplus, and you're going to see that population explode as it consumes everything in its environment. And this is what we've seen over the last 10,000 years or more through what I would call the domesticated mindset, which is essentially humans figured out how to get any and every calorie out of an environment. In part, we have the ability to do so because we can manipulate environments with our hands. We can manipulate, we can cook food, which means we can eat pretty much anything that would have been rotten or things that have toxic chemicals in them that are denatured through cooking. And you combine all of that with this idea, and we have the potential to completely obliterate our landscapes. And so, to me, this is what domestication means. Domestication is the process of holding the world captive, holding all of the calories in an environment captive, and not allowing anything else to consume them. And it started with, on a micro level, maybe, humans blocking out the ability for other animals to consume deer, potentially, and then it's extrapolated into plants as well, where we're in agriculture, we weed out plants we don't want to compete for nutrients and sunlight and these different things, and we put up fences and scarecrows and all of these other things to prevent our competitors from getting, quote unquote, our food. So there's this automatic idea of property, in a sense, or an extension of self that extends our body and our perception of self to the things that we're growing and controlling. It's almost like projecting a kind of technology onto the ecosystem itself, instead of just seeing a rock, stone tool, for example, as an extension of our body. Now the extension goes all the way to the actual food that we're consuming. So instead of seeing a deer as a wild animal that we're hunting, now it's an extension of our own body, that we control in totality through captivity, through domestication. And there's lots of interesting stuff about how humans perceive of themselves as I think there's a difference here too between like an animistic perspective as well as an inanimist perspective in terms of how we see ourselves. But if we think about even the earliest farming cultures were still animist. So it's not even that there's a break between animism and inanimism. To me, the idea of being able to consume everything in an environment and doing so is essentially maybe what created animism. Because if we look at how humans, especially place-based indigenous societies that are living in reciprocity, not all of them have, not all of them do. Humans are constantly experimenting with landscapes, and all over the world we can see different, mistakes that people made in their places that potentially caused them to transform their societies. And one of my theories is actually that domestication is essentially a Pandora's box that opened up, 20 to 50,000 years ago, this idea that we could consume whatever we wanted in our landscape. And it's transformed over time and grown in complexity. But that humans started to realize that this was a mistake in different places after they had ecological micro collapses. And so instead of abandoning domestication altogether, what they did was create cultural limitations to growth. Since we basically obliterated our environmental limitation to growth through, this idea of the law of limited competition, which is essentially just a thought. And once that thought occurs, it becomes really hard to undo that thought. And I don't think other animals have that thought. I think it's innate that they don't overconsume. It's innate that a bear doesn't go out and out-compete its neighbors or seek out to destroy its competitors. That's just a process of their living. It's not something that they would ever think to do. And I feel that humans somehow had that thought and then started transforming ecosystems and causing micro collapses and realizing that they needed cultural limitations to growth. And I believe that animism, if you listen to my original interview with Leonard Martin on psychology, he has this idea called the delayed return compensation theory, which basically kind of says that a lot of religions and cultural practices are all in place because we've disconnected from what we call our immediate return psychology that we potentially evolved within. That's a whole other kind of rabbit hole. But just that culture and delayed return culture is basically trying to find a way to make humans live in balance with our ecosystems again. And so something like animism, which is a cultural story that says actually, in a lot of different, like North American societies, for example, humans arrived last. They're like the last animal to be created. And so we have to learn from the other animals how to live in harmony in our ecosystems. And so a lot of practices come from mimicking those cycles of other animals. And what that does is it basically puts a brake on our consumption. It puts a brake on the way we enact and engage landscape management or landscape disturbance for our own consumptive purposes to exist. And that's not to say that everybody followed those, but you can see even in like a post-Mayan civilization, if you look at like, Martín Prechtel's work, or even like the book Maya Forest Gardens, you can see there's this knowledge of regenerative practice and of limitations to growth. They have this concept called spiritual debt, where creating even just technology or harvesting things from the landscape requires a lot of ritual offerings. So you have to like write songs and poetry and perform these things and make things and give offerings. And it makes things, quote unquote, spiritually expensive. But I would just say that that's like a deep ecological understanding of the price of life comes at the cost of consumption from the ecosystem. And so it's a cultural limiting factor to prevent that kind of growth. This is getting really into the weeds here around what I think wildness means, which again, if we look at the sort of challenge between wildness and domestication, then wildness is what I what I call a congress of wills. So if every living thing has a will, even non-living things like a gravity, any force of nature, that force of nature, that's kind of a way of saying will, right? Like a will is the individual animal's force of nature. And there's this whole question, does free will exist? Yes and no, right? Like they're in our forces of nature, our desires, our impulses have been generated through natural selection. And so our brains respond in particular ways. Yes, we do have the ability to make choices, but those choices are limited by our evolution. The more we can understand about those, the more we can learn how to get our wills to flow in the directions that we want them to, right? So it's not that we don't have free will, it's that it's a combination of both. We do have choices, but those choices can be limited. So how to figure out how to, transform the limitations of those choices. But all things have this force within them. And when we come together, we form a collection of wills that I call the Congress of Wills, which can be competitive, could be collaborative. It's an ebb and flow of disturbance and regeneration. That to me is wildness. It's not just returning to being more aggressive and stealing food from other animals or something, right? There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more potential for collaboration, for understanding the balance, for not over-consuming from our landscapes. Just because we can eat everything doesn't mean that we should. And so, to me, rewilding is understanding all of these things and then creating a culture around that understanding. So to embrace wildness is to follow the law of limited competition, or figure out how to follow the law of limited competition to the best of our abilities. And what that means is, at this point in time, generating cultural limitations to do so. I think about Jubilee was one example. A pastor friend of mine talked to me about where, every 50 years in the Jewish tradition, they would destroy, burn all of the, forgive all the debts and let all the slaves free. So there's this understanding that accumulation of wealth is a problem, and we have to build in a regular process for diminishing the problems that happen with accumulated wealth by getting rid of it, and accumulated debts and these different things, right? Here in the Northwest, the civilization here, if you want to call that a civilization, there's some challenging aspects around that. The culture, the societies here on the Northwest, they practiced what we call the potlatch, or rather what they called the potlatch, which was basically bringing all of the excess resources that had been generated over the year together to a village. An elder would distribute the resources to different families that needed them, and then they would burn everything, basically completely making everybody on the same page again, in terms of accumulated wealth. They still had a hierarchy here. They still had problems, but I think in that regard, but I think that there's this deeper understanding of needing to limit growth, and that growth is a product of accumulation, and that every society around the world has been dealing with these challenges in different ways for thousands and thousands of years. And the societies that still live today as immediate return hunter-gatherers are the ones that live in margins where delayed return living is actually extremely challenging. And so they don't even have to, the geography of itself is one of the things that can create an immediate return type of society. So, the Hadza, for example, they live in the desert in what we consider a marginal environment. And they do fine. They're not like starving to death, but there's no real way for them to accumulate as much wealth, because they can eat on a daily basis. They don't have to store any food at all. But if you think about, food storage is one of the main components of domestication. It's one of the main components of conflict. And basically what a herd of deer is, if you put it in a box, it's stored living food. So instead of a granary, which is a sedentary food storage, a a herd that you control is a mobile food storage that you could kill at any point that you want. Um, and that becomes a huge problem for people, because then once you have something that you have to defend, automatically we see an increase in interspecies violence between humans. So, and other than humans, right? Because if you're having to block access, for example, from wolves, then wolves who might have just been a potential collaborator and potential competitor in the wild, now all of a sudden they are solely a competitor because they want to get in and eat the food that you've just denied them access to. And so now you're fighting these other animals. It becomes a pest only because you've claimed all of the food as your own. The same is true of agricultural crops, where, what we call pests are just animals trying to eat what food is in their environment. And we've taken over that environment and claimed it to be ours and ours alone. And in doing so, our populations increase, we end up being more sedentary, and we create more destruction. So it's just all of these positive feedback loops that domestication, what I call domestication, generates. Now, obviously, not everybody uses domestication in that way. But to me, if we really look at examine domestication, it's solely about captivity. And the things that we call domestication are either things that make captivity easier or things that we selectively breed for to make captivity easier. So like earlier when I said pro-socialization is one of the things that people use to talk about domestication, I would say that pro-socialization happens through mutualistic relationships between, both different species, but as well as members of a species. So humans became more pro-social as a survival strategy through natural selection. Same with the wolf becoming a dog through natural selection. And then at some point, it becomes more of a parasitic relationship of captivity, where, again, it's sort of this biological technology where humans are projecting their sense of self beyond just the technological inanimate object to biological entities that we've created through our culture in order to utilize and exploit even more resources in our environments. So to ask the question, what is rewilding? Try to explain and decompress all of these things in a 30-second elevator pitch, and it's not possible. This is why it's so frustrating to me when I see people using the word rewilding as a synonym for foraging, or people when they say that rewilding is a lifestyle, and what they're really talking about is like a paleo lifestyle that includes survival skills. Rewilding is not a lifestyle. Rewilding is a worldview. It's a context, a framework that recognizes what wildness is, or what wildness could be. It recognizes the law of limited competition and understands that many cultures around the world have broken this law and are trying to figure out their way back to cultural limitations to growth. You can create any kind of lifestyle under that framework. It doesn't have to look a certain way. So when I see, inspirational people like, Phoenicia Madrano, who was living on the Hoop on horseback, or Lynx Vilden, attempting to live as what she considers to be a hunter-gatherer. These sort of extremes, and people call that rewilding. That's definitely one version of rewilding, but that's not what rewilding means. What rewilding means is a framework that then you can apply to different aspects of your life. And so, but it's not romantic to be rewilding in a city and growing food in a garden. It's like you're just gardening. And so the media hates picking up on that kind of stuff. What they want to see is hunting and gathering and these sort of romantic notions of wildness, rather than actual practical application that anybody could attain, or the diversity of actions that people could take within the framework of understanding rewilding, of reclaiming a relationship of wildness, of working in collaboration with, and maybe some competitiveness with our environments, but not overly consuming all of the things within it because we can, just because we can. Oftentimes, I see people just start using the word who don't understand the origins of it, who haven't examined it. And it's essentially like, somebody who has, it's usually noobs who are taking the word and using it in the wrong way, or using it in a way that diminishes these meanings that I've been explaining in this last hour or so. It's important to note here that things like ancestral technology, you could be rewilding and never even do any kind of ancestral technology. You could be rewilding and never go hunting. You could be rewilding and never go foraging. You could be rewilding and just solely focused on building kinship networks between different people. Like maybe your thing is socialization and community building. That in and of itself, if you're doing it through this lens of trying to get people to understand, how to live in an ecologically regenerative way by reducing our disturbance on the landscape, by limiting the growth of people in some sort of cultural fashion, the way Mayan society perhaps does, or the way, just different cultures around the world have done these kinds of things. That could be your focus. You could just focus on writing stories and mythology, and that could be a form of culturally crafting a rewilding society. At the end of the day, there is going to be a matter of subsistence. And where that comes into play is this other fundamental, important part of rewilding, which is understanding the collapse of societies and ecosystems. So if we can recognize that domestication is an inherently destructive force that is basically an overconsumptive disturbance, it doesn't mean we have to completely get rid of it, but it means we have to rein it in to the fullest extent that we can. Because if we have the ability to create this disturbance, we must understand how to compensate for that with regeneration. And if we understand that this disturbance has led to the sixth mass extinction, then we can understand that society is in a state of decline and is about to collapse on a large scale because our ecosystems are collapsing. So rewilding innately recognizes the inevitability of collapse. It doesn't mean that we're rewilding to survive the collapse the way that prepping does, right? Like prepping is a culture of surviving the collapse of society. It's not a critique of civilization. It's not an understanding of even what causes collapse. Prepping is just about surviving long enough through a collapse, and oftentimes is about rebuilding civilization. So when preppers are doing this, they're not doing it because they understand the intricacies that cause civilizational collapse. They just know that it's going to collapse for all the same reasons, but they don't understand why. They don't understand how it will probably never come back to the extent that it is, and why we wouldn't even want that, right? So it's not rewilding isn't about like worrying about or surviving through collapse, but it is about acknowledging and understanding collapse so that we can create regenerative societies. You don't have to be afraid of the collapse or be prepping to survive the collapse. You don't have to be thinking of your rewilding journey as a way to survive the collapse of civilization. What rewilding is returning to a regenerative culture that is in the Congress of Wills. So you don't have to survive the collapse of civilization to be rewilding. Your methods of rewilding don't have to have anything to do with collapse. They could solely be on how to create regenerative society. You could just plant trees all day and not learn any survival skills. And then when collapse happens, you may or may not live, as collapse intensifies, we're all going to die at some point anyway, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to need to learn how to survive the collapse of civilization and focus on primitive skills or ancestral skills and survival skills and prepping. I mean, just being emergency prepared is important. But that's not the goal of rewilding. The goal of rewilding isn't so that you can survive the collapse of civilization. The goal of rewilding is returning to wildness. It's reconnecting with our landscapes. And I could die in a car accident tomorrow, and still have been doing as much rewilding as possible in my lifetime. There isn't ever going to be a point where we've quote unquote rewilded. When I was young, I think maybe I thought if I could go live like a hunter gatherer, like, Phoenicia or what Lynx is doing, that I could be rewilded. But that's not what rewilding is. Rewilding is a process, and it's a never ending process because we're in a never ending relationship with our landscape. So it's a constant conversation, it's a constant dialogue. We're never just going to be, oh, I'm wild now. We're always going to be asking, if we're rewilding, we're always going to be asking, what is our impact with our disturbances that we create by existing? And how do we make sure that our impacts are balanced out with regeneration? That's how organisms persist in the long run, not necessarily thinking about it, but practicing it. And, whether or not, that's the difference between what humans can do. We can think about this. So do we have as much power as we think? Probably not. It may just end up being an evolutionary process that we have little or no say in at this point. How long humans are still here, how long civilization's disturbances are going to be a part of the planet. But it's important to understand that we do have the ability to encourage as much biodiversity and life as possible. And that to me is rewilding, is figuring out a context in my life in which I can promote more life. I can reduce my disturbances, both individually and culturally, and I can encourage regeneration and growth of ecosystems. And how do I do that? And what are the morals for me? I don't think that we should pigeonhole rewilding as any particular kind of thing. I think it needs to be that broad, encompassing idea of embracing wildness, of understanding the law of limited competition, of creating cultural limitations to growth, and that these are going to happen in micro contexts all around the world as civilizations decline and collapse. And so through rewilding, we can give ourselves a little bit of a leg up in that process by recognizing that these systems exist, recognizing that they're happening right now, and then looking at other societies that do live in ways that are more regenerative and trying to mimic them and elevate them, and also reclaiming our own traditions of regeneration that we can find, either through contemporary living societies or in the archaeological record or in ancient history books, all the things, while also inventing new ways to live in our place as climate change and the inevitable transformation of ecosystems just happens. So it's sort of, looking at all of these different things and then figuring out a way to do it. It's sort of complex and complicated. And then it can leave people feeling like, well, what the hell do I do? And I think it's just a thing of we just have to do something, just start somewhere with this concept of regeneration and how to limit our growth and limit our disturbances and increase our regenerative impact. And so I think, with conservation rewilding and human rewilding, these will come together inevitably as long as we continue to focus on bringing them together like this. Another thing I want to say too is that a lot of times when we see rewilding in the human context or the paleo lifestyle co-option, there's a depoliticizing of it. Rewilding is a crime. Let's just make sure that people understand. The state is a product of domestication. If rewilding is against domestication, then rewilding is innately considered a crime by the state. It's one thing for someone a wealthy person to be able to go out and live their life as a wannabe hunter-gatherer in the forest somewhere And a completely different experience for indigenous people, for example, at Standing Rock, who are literally putting their bodies in front of the oil industry and their military enforcement to prevent the toxification of our water. That to me is more rewilding than somebody learning how to forage on the weekend. That's not to say that's not important too, but to recognize that rewilding is political, inherently political. Domestication, if we are undoing the barriers to wildness, those barriers are created by cultures of domestication, which is what the state and civilization are. So by aligning ourselves with wildness, we're aligning ourselves against the culture of domestication. And that's an important component that is often left out of those conversations, because I think most of these people that are getting into the word rewilding through things like the paleo diet are doing it from an individual selfish point of view, and are doing it essentially to get like 6-pack abs or something, right? Like they're not understanding this broader ecosystem relationship. And if they keep going down the rabbit hole, they'll get there. But it's this sort of superficial point of entry. And I know a lot of people who went in at that superficial point of entry and then fell further and further and further and climbed further into this exploration of wildness. That doesn't mean that everybody who's doing rewilding stuff has to do illegal things. I'm not saying that at all. I just want to point out that it is innately politicized. And that's something that needs to stick with the definition if it's going to continue to persist. I could go on and on and on about rewilding. And I'm going to stop there because it's been an hour. And I hope that this little exploration sparked some more ideas. I hope some of this was new for y'all. And yeah, let's keep on keeping on with this actual meaning of rewilding. And, take the context that is rewilding and think about how to create your own life or lifestyle within that context. But don't pigeonhole rewilding as a conservation technique. Don't pigeonhole rewilding as an extension of a paleo lifestyle. Don't pigeonhole it as anything. Let's keep it this broad understanding of domestication, the problems of domestication, and not following the laws of limited competition, and see where we go from there. Embrace the Congress of Wills. If you got something out of this podcast and you want to see me keep going and keep talking to other awesome people, not just ranting by myself, please become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. And huge thanks to all my patrons. It's been super, super helpful to be getting that kind of support, and definitely is helping me continue. Also, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share on social media. I hope you all are doing well, and we'll catch you on the next one.